August 10th, 991 AD. The tidal causeway at Maldon, Essex, England. The morning mist rose slowly from the river Blackwater, revealing a sight that should have filled every Viking heart with terror. Across the water, assembled on the mainland, stood the full might of East Saxon England. 200 ships, perhaps 10,000 warriors, the largest English force gathered in decades, commanded by Ealdorman Berthnoth, one of the most experienced and respected war leaders in the kingdom. On the island of Northy, trapped by the incoming tide, stood a Viking raiding force of barely 13 ships, perhaps 500 to 700 warriors, outnumbered at least 15 to 1, cut off from escape, facing certain annihilation. The English could simply wait. Hunger and thirst would do the work without risking a single English life. But what happened over the next 6 hours would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and mythologized battles in English history. A battle where overwhelming numerical superiority meant nothing, where the defender's advantage was thrown away through pride, where a single tactical decision transformed certain victory into catastrophic defeat, where Viking warriors, outnumbered beyond reason, carved through English forces like a blade through silk. This is the Battle of Maldon, where 13 Viking ships destroyed an English army, where heroic stupidity met ruthless pragmatism, where Anglo-Saxon poetry immortalized defeat, and where England learned that numbers alone cannot win wars. To understand the catastrophe at Maldon, to comprehend how such an impossible defeat occurred, we must first understand the England of 991 AD, a kingdom under siege, drowning and Viking raids, and led by one of the weakest kings in English history. This was the reign of Ethelred II, who would earn the nickname Unread, meaning poorly advised or no counsel, later corrupted into the Unready. Ethelred had inherited the throne in 978 after his half-brother King Edward was mysteriously murdered, possibly with Ethelred's mother's involvement, a shadow that would haunt his entire reign. He was young, weak-willed, and surrounded by advisors who gave him terrible counsel or manipulated him for their own advantage. Under his rule, England was fragmenting. The unity that his predecessors had built through decades of warfare against the Vikings was crumbling. The Viking threat had returned with a vengeance after a generation of relative peace. Since 980, Viking raids had intensified year after year, hitting coastal towns and monasteries, burning, looting, enslaving, then disappearing before English forces could respond. These were not the settlement-seeking Vikings of earlier centuries who came to conquer and farm. These were professional raiders from Norway and Denmark, warriors who had refined raiding into a science, who struck with devastating speed and vanished before defenders could organize. They understood that England was weak, divided, and rich. English monasteries were stuffed with silver. English farms produced abundant crops. English slaves fetched high prices in Scandinavian and Mediterranean markets. England in 991 was a target-rich environment defended by a kingdom that had forgotten how to fight.
The Viking force that arrived at the Blackwater estuary in August 991 was led by Olaf Tryggvason, a Norwegian prince who would later become King Olaf I of Norway, one of the most significant figures in Scandinavian history. But in 991, he was a raider, a mercenary, a warrior seeking wealth and reputation. Olaf was approximately 30 years old, raised in the Viking tradition, trained in warfare since childhood, and already a veteran of numerous campaigns across the Baltic, Russia, and Western Europe. He understood English weaknesses intimately because he had been raiding England for years, studying English responses, noting their slowness to mobilize, their tendency to negotiate rather than fight, their lack of coordination between different regions. Olaf's 13 ships represented perhaps 500 to 700 warriors. The numbers are debated by historians, depending on how many men each longship carried. A Viking longship could carry 60 to 80 men, but on raiding voyages, they often carried fewer to leave room for plunder. Conservative estimates suggest 50 men per ship, giving Olaf about 650 warriors. These were not conscripts or farmers forced into military service. These were professional warriors who fought for a living, who had trained with weapons since they could walk, who viewed combat as their primary occupation and source of wealth. They wore mail armor if they could afford it, leather and padded cloth if they could not, and carried shields, swords, axes, and spears. More importantly, they were mobile, disciplined, and experienced, having fought in dozens of engagements across northern Europe. The Vikings had sailed up the River Blackwater, a tidal estuary in Essex, in early August, looking for a rich target to plunder. They found it in Maldon, a prosperous Anglo-Saxon town and an important trading center. The Vikings landed on Northey Island, a strategic position in the estuary, separated from the mainland by a causeway that was covered at high tide and exposed at low tide. It was a defensive position that protected them from immediate assault, but also potentially trapped them if English forces arrived in strength. And English forces did arrive in unprecedented numbers. Ealdorman Byrhtnoth, the military commander of Essex, one of the most powerful nobles in England, received word of the Viking landing and immediately began gathering forces. This was the moment England had been waiting for. For over a decade, Vikings had been raiding with impunity, striking and disappearing before English armies could respond. But now a Viking force had trapped itself on an island, cut off from easy escape, and could be brought to battle and destroyed. Byrhtnoth sent messengers to every manor and town in Essex and beyond, calling up the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia system where free men owed military service to their lords. The response was overwhelming. From across Essex, Suffolk, and neighboring counties, warriors converged on Maldon. Thanes, the Anglo-Saxon nobility, arrived with their household warriors, fully equipped and trained. Churls, free farmers, arrived with spears and shields, less well-equipped but numerous. Within days, Byrhtnoth had assembled the largest English army in a generation. 10,000 men, according to some estimates, though medieval numbers are always uncertain. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests at least several thousand English warriors, vastly outnumbering the Vikings. The English also had 200 ships assembled in the estuary, an enormous fleet by early medieval standards, enough to blockade the Vikings completely, prevent their escape, and starve them into submission if necessary. Byrhtnoth was approximately 60 years old in 991, ancient by medieval standards, but still vigorous and commanding. He stood exceptionally tall for the period. Sources describe him as towering over other men, perhaps 6 feet 3 inches or more in an age when most men were several inches shorter. He was wealthy, owning vast estates across East Anglia, politically powerful as one of King Athelred's senior advisors, and militarily experienced, having fought in numerous campaigns over his long career. He was also piously Christian, generous to monasteries, and deeply concerned with honor and reputation. This concern with honor, with being remembered as a brave warrior rather than a cautious general, would prove fatal. The tactical situation on August 10th was absolutely in England's favor. The Vikings were trapped on Northey Island, a narrow piece of land perhaps 400 yards long and 100 yards wide at high tide. The causeway connecting the island to the mainland was narrow, perhaps 20 feet wide, and could only be crossed at low tide. The English controlled the mainland side of the causeway with overwhelming force. The Vikings could not escape by sea because the English fleet blocked the estuary. They could not break out across the causeway because the English army blocked it with a force perhaps 15 times larger than the Viking force. All Byrhtnoth had to do was wait. Hunger, thirst, and eventually disease would force the Vikings to surrender or attempt a suicidal breakout that would be easily crushed. But Byrhtnoth did not wait. What happened next has been debated by historians and military analysts for over 1,000 years, preserved in one of the finest pieces of Anglo-Saxon poetry, the Battle of Maldon, written within decades of the event by someone who may have been present or interviewed survivors. The poem describes how a Viking messenger crossed the causeway at low tide under a flag of truce and addressed Byrhtnoth with an offer. The Vikings would leave peacefully in exchange for Danegeld, protection money, tribute in silver. This was becoming standard Viking practice in England. Raid, threaten, accept payment to leave, then return next year for more. The amount demanded at Maldon is not recorded in the poem, but contemporary sources suggest Vikings were demanding thousands of pounds of silver from English regions. Berthnot's response, preserved in the poem, was defiant and is echoed through English history. "Listen, seafarer, to what this people says. They will give you spears for tribute, poisoned point and ancient sword, such war gear that will not serve you well in battle. Herald of the seamen, take back a message. Tell your people much more hateful news, that here stands with his troop an undisgraced earl who will defend this homeland." It was a magnificent response, the speech of a hero from legend, and it doomed thousands of Englishmen to death. The Vikings withdrew to Northey Island, and the waiting began. The tide came in, covering the causeway, making it impassable. The English army held their position on the mainland, completely blocking any Viking attempt to cross. Hours passed. The tide turned and began to recede, exposing the causeway again. As the water level dropped, both armies moved into position. The English formed a shield wall on the mainland end of the causeway, a dense formation of overlapping shields creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. The Vikings formed up on the island end, preparing to attempt the crossing. But here the tactical reality became apparent. The causeway was so narrow that only 3 men could stand abreast, perhaps 4 if they squeezed together. For the Vikings to cross, they would have to advance in a column just 3 or 4 men wide, directly into an English shield wall hundreds of men deep that could bring massive force against that narrow front. It would be slaughter. The first Vikings to attempt the crossing would be killed immediately, and those behind them would have to climb over the bodies of their comrades to advance into the same killing zone. Medieval warfare was not like modern combat where firepower allows small forces to hold choke points against larger armies. In hand-to-hand combat, numbers matter enormously, and the English had overwhelming numerical superiority concentrated at a choke point. 3 English warriors stood at the causeway entrance in the poem, named as Wulfstan, Elfrey, and Maccus, heroes who held the narrow passage against all Viking attempts to cross. The Vikings tried repeatedly to force the causeway, according to the poem, but could not break through. Every warrior who attempted the crossing was killed or driven back wounded. The English defenders were supported by ranks of warriors behind them, so when one man tired, he could step back and be replaced by a fresh warrior, while the Viking attackers had no such luxury. The tactical situation was impossible for the Vikings, and they knew it. They were trapped, facing slow death by starvation or quick death in a futile assault. Then Bertnoth made the decision that has puzzled, fascinated, and appalled historians for a millennium. He ordered his forces to withdraw from the causeway and allow the Vikings to cross unopposed, to give up the defensive advantage and fight on equal terms on the open ground of the mainland. The poem describes his reasoning with a single word, overmod. The meaning of this Old English word has been debated endlessly. It is usually translated as pride or overconfidence, but it carries connotations of excessive pride, the kind of arrogance that blinds you to reality, that makes you throw away certain victory because you want a more glorious battle. Some historians defend Bertnoth, arguing he had sound tactical reasons. Perhaps he feared his army would simply desert if forced to sit idle. Anglo-Saxon fired militias were not professional soldiers. They were farmers called away from their fields, and if the campaign dragged on for days or weeks, they would drift away to return to their harvests. Perhaps he believed a decisive battle would prevent future raids by demonstrating English willingness to fight. Perhaps he thought defeating the Vikings in open battle would be more psychologically devastating than starving them into submission. But most historians believe overmod is exactly what the poem says it was. Bertnoth's pride, his desire for a glorious victory in a fair fight, his need to be remembered as a hero who defeated the Vikings in open combat rather than the cautious general who waited behind a barrier. He wanted to fight the way heroes fought in the old stories, sword against sword, courage against courage, and damn the tactical realities.
The English warriors withdrew from the causeway head, pulling back perhaps 100 yards, forming a new shield wall on the mainland, but leaving the causeway open. The Vikings, who moments before had faced impossible odds, could not believe their fortune. Sources describe confusion among the Viking ranks, warriors asking their commanders if this was a trick, if the English were baiting a trap. But Olaf Tryggvason recognized the gift he had been handed. English pride had given him a chance, and he would not waste it. The Vikings began crossing the causeway in organized units, not rushing, but moving deliberately, maintaining formation as they transitioned from the constricted causeway to the open ground. As they emerged onto the mainland, they spread out, forming their own shield wall,
expanding their front from the narrow column forced by the causeway to a proper battle line that could engage the English on equal terms. This was the critical moment, the transition from causeway to battlefield, and it was conducted with discipline that demonstrated these were professional warriors who knew their craft. Within perhaps 30 minutes, the entire Viking force had crossed and deployed into battle formation. Approximately 650 Vikings now faced approximately 10,000 English warriors on open ground. The odds were still overwhelmingly against the Vikings, but the situation had transformed from impossible to merely desperate. In a narrow causeway, 650 men had no chance against 10,000. On open ground, with room to maneuver and fight, 650 elite warriors might achieve something if they were skillful and lucky and their enemies made mistakes. The English still had every advantage except the most important one. They were led by a commander who had voluntarily surrendered his strongest position. The two shield walls formed up facing each other across perhaps 100 yards of open ground. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall was a military formation used across early medieval Northern Europe, a densely packed line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping to create a barrier. The front rank held their shields forward, creating a continuous wall of linden wood and iron. The second rank held their shields overhead, protecting against arrows and thrown weapons. The ranks behind provided pushing power, literally shoving the front ranks forward, while also being ready to step into gaps when front rank warriors fell. It was a simple formation, but devastatingly effective when properly maintained, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier against frontal assault. The Vikings used a similar formation, but with tactical variations perfected through decades of warfare across Europe. Their shield wall was likely deeper relative to its width, creating a more compact, mobile formation that could pivot and maneuver more easily than the extended English line. The Vikings also employed a tactic called the svinfylking, or swine array, a wedge formation where warriors formed a triangle that could concentrate force at a single point in the enemy line, attempting to break through rather than pushing along the entire front. Both armies began the battle with the traditional preliminaries of early medieval combat. Warriors in the front ranks hurled insults and challenges, attempting to provoke individual opponents into breaking formation for single combat. Javelins and throwing axes arced through the air, both sides attempting to disrupt enemy formations before the main clash. Archers, if either side had any in significant numbers, which is unclear from the sources, would have shot volleys into enemy formations.
Then, the two shield walls came together with a crash that witnesses described as deafening. The sound of hundreds of wooden shields striking simultaneously, of metal against metal, of men shouting war cries and screaming in pain. The initial impact of two shield walls meeting is the most critical moment of this type of combat. Whichever side hits harder, maintains better cohesion, and pushes more aggressively in those first seconds, gains a psychological advantage that can determine the battle. The Vikings, despite being vastly outnumbered, hit the English line with shocking ferocity. These were men fighting for their lives, knowing that defeat meant death with no possibility of retreat, while many English warriors were farmers fulfilling military obligations, brave enough, but not professional soldiers. The difference in motivation showed immediately. The English line buckled in places under the Viking assault, but the English numerical superiority prevented a breakthrough. Where Vikings pushed forward, English warriors surrounded them from the sides, and the sheer weight of numbers pushed the Vikings back. The battle settled into a grinding, brutal shoving match along the entire line, each side pushing against the other, warriors in the front ranks hacking with swords and axes, stabbing with spears, trying to break the enemy formation while maintaining their own. This was warfare at its most primitive and exhausting, requiring enormous physical strength and endurance. Warriors in the front ranks could only fight for minutes at a time before exhaustion forced them to rotate to the rear, but in the press of bodies, rotation was difficult. Bertenouth commanded from the front of the English line, as was expected of Anglo-Saxon nobles. He was not directing from a safe rear position, but fighting personally, his great height making him a visible target, his wealth evident in his armor and weapons. The Anglo-Saxon concept of leadership required nobles to fight at the front, to share the risks their men faced, to lead by example rather than from safety.
It was an admirable tradition that produced legendary heroes and also frequently resulted in leadership being killed in battle, leaving armies leaderless and prone to collapse. Byrhtnoth fought with sword and shield like a hero from the old songs, personally killing several Vikings according to the poem, his warriors rallying around his towering figure. But the Vikings were targeting him specifically, recognizing that killing the English commander would shatter English morale. Olaf Tryggvason, leading from the Viking front ranks as Viking culture also demanded, may have personally directed warriors toward Byrhtnoth's position. The English line was too strong to break by frontal assault, but if the English commander fell, the psychological impact might cause the line to waver. A Viking warrior, unnamed in the poem, hurled a javelin that struck Byrhtnoth. The poem describes him pulling the javelin from his body and throwing it back, killing the Viking who had thrown it, but the wound was serious. Blood flowed from the injury, weakening him. Other Vikings saw the wound and concentrated their attacks on him. He fought on, but he was slowing, weakening. Another weapon, the sources are unclear whether it was a thrown spear, an arrow, or a sword thrust, struck him in a vital area. This time, the wound was fatal.
Byrhtnoth fell in the front rank of his shield wall, the towering commander crashing to the ground, his sword falling from weakening hands. The poem records his final words as a prayer commending his soul to God, appropriate for a deeply Christian noble. I thank you, Lord of nations, for all the joys I have known in this world. Now, merciful Creator, I have most need that you grant my spirit grace, that my soul may travel to you into your keeping. Lord of angels, depart in peace. I pray to you that the devils of hell may not humiliate it. He died there, in the front line, surrounded by his warriors, having achieved the heroic death he apparently desired. But his death doomed the army he commanded. The moment Byrhtnoth fell, the English shield wall began to waver. The warriors who had been fighting around him saw their commander killed, saw the man who had led them into battle and promised them victory, lying dead, and fear spread like fire. Some warriors, particularly among the household retainers who had served Byrhtnoth for years, fought harder in rage and grief, trying to avenge their lord or die in the attempt. The poem names several of these heroes. Alfinn, who shouted encouragement and reminded the warriors of their oaths. Offa, who fought until he too was killed. Leosunu, who vowed never to retreat and died keeping that vow. Dunare, an old warrior who killed many Vikings before falling. And Berthwold, whose speech became one of the most famous passages in Anglo-Saxon literature. Mind must be firmer, heart keener, courage greater as our strength lessens. Here lies our Lord, all cut down, a good man in the dust. He who thinks now to turn from this battle play can lament forever. But not all English warriors shared this heroic determination to die fighting alongside their fallen commander. The Anglo-Saxon furred militia system had a fatal weakness. It depended on personal loyalty to individual lords rather than abstract loyalty to kingdom or nation. When your lord fell, your obligation technically ended. Some English warriors, particularly those from distant manors who had joined the army out of regional obligation rather than personal loyalty to Byrhtnoth, began to slip away from the battle line. At first it was individuals, then small groups, then entire units as the contagion of fear spread. The poem preserves the names of some of the first to flee with bitter contempt. Godric, son of Oda, who seized Byrhtnoth's horse and rode away, causing other English warriors to mistake him for Byrhtnoth retreating and thus triggering a larger rout. Godric's brothers Godwin and Godwig fled with him, abandoning their comrades to death. These early deserters broke the psychological cohesion of the English army. Warriors who had been holding firm, who had been pushing against the shield wall with determination, saw men fleeing and wondered if they should flee too. The shield wall, which depends utterly on every man holding his position and trusting the men beside him to do the same, began to fall apart. Gaps appeared in the line. Vikings pushed through these gaps, attacking English warriors from the sides and rear. The disciplined formation dissolved into a confused melee of small groups fighting desperately while surrounded. Once the shield wall broke, the battle was effectively over. An organized formation of warriors can defeat a much larger disorganized mob, and that was exactly what happened at Maldon. The Vikings maintained their cohesion, fighting as units, supporting each other, while the English army fragmented into individuals fighting for survival.
The Vikings pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. These were men who had fought in dozens of battles, who understood that the moment to strike hardest is when the enemy formation breaks. They did not pause to rest or celebrate their success, but immediately launched a general assault all along the line, pushing hard into the disintegrating English formation. English warriors were cut down by the hundreds, by the thousands. Those who tried to flee found that running from Vikings was futile. The Vikings had reserves who had not yet been engaged in the frontline fighting, fresh warriors who could pursue the fleeing English. Some English units, particularly the household warriors who had served Berthnoth personally, refused to flee despite their commander's death and the collapse of the army around them. They formed small shield walls, circles of warriors standing back to back, determined to die honorably. The poem honors these men, describing how they fought until killed to the last man, maintaining their oaths to their lord beyond his death. But their heroism, however admirable, could not change the tactical reality. The battle was lost. By late afternoon, the Viking victory was complete. The battlefield was covered with English dead. Exact casualty figures do not exist for medieval battles, but the poem and later sources suggest thousands of English warriors died at Maldon. Some historians estimate 3,000 to 5,000 English dead out of an army of perhaps 10,000, though these numbers are speculative. What is certain is that the English army was destroyed as a fighting force, scattered and broken. The Viking casualties were likely significant as well, perhaps several hundred dead in the brutal shield wall fighting, but they remained an intact, organized force that now controlled the battlefield and the surrounding region. The aftermath of Maldon was catastrophic for England beyond the immediate battlefield losses. Olaf Tryggvason's 13 ships had not just won a battle, they had shattered English morale and demonstrated English vulnerability to the entire Viking world. News of the victory spread across Scandinavia, transmitted by surviving Vikings returning home with plunder and glory. England was weak, divided, and could be defeated even when it assembled overwhelming force. The victory at Maldon triggered a massive increase in Viking raiding over the following years. Where a few shiploads of raiders had come before, now entire fleets arrived. King Ethelred, rather than responding militarily, chose to pay the Vikings enormous sums of silver to leave, establishing the Danegeld system that would drain England's wealth for decades. In the immediate aftermath of Maldon, Ethelred paid Olaf Tryggvason 22,000 pounds of silver, an enormous sum representing years of tax revenue, just to make him and his men leave. But this payment established a terrible precedent. It proved that raiding England was profitable, even when you did not capture much plunder directly, because the English would pay you to leave. Over the next 25 years, England would pay progressively larger Danegeld payments, £24,000 in 1002, £36,000 in 1007, £48,000 in 1012. By 1018, England paid £82,500 of silver in a single payment, a sum so vast it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in medieval history. All of this can be traced back to the psychological impact of Maldon, the demonstration that England would pay rather than fight, that English armies could be defeated even when they had every advantage.
The death of Berthnoth at Maldon also had immediate political consequences within England. He had been one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, a stabilizing influence on the weak King Ethelred. With Berthanoth dead, the political balance shifted. Other nobles jockeyed for power and influence. The unity that Berthanoth had represented, the willingness to gather forces and confront Vikings, was replaced by regional fragmentation and self-interest. Nobles began prioritizing the defense of their own estates over collective defense of the kingdom. This fragmentation made England even more vulnerable to Viking raids. The psychological impact of Maldon on the English population was profound and lasting. For generations, the English had believed themselves capable of defending their land against Viking attacks. The great King Alfred had defeated the Vikings in the 9th century, and his descendants had gradually reconquered the Danelaw and united England. But Maldon shattered that confidence. If an English army with overwhelming superiority could be destroyed by a small Viking force, what hope was there? The Battle of Maldon became a cultural trauma for the Anglo-Saxons, a moment when their martial confidence was broken. The poem, The Battle of Maldon, preserves this trauma, celebrating the heroism of individuals who died fighting, while implicitly criticizing the overmode pride that led to the disaster. The poem was copied and preserved not as a celebration of victory, but as a meditation on courage, duty, loyalty, and the consequences of pride. It became one of the defining texts of Anglo-Saxon literature, studied and analyzed for centuries, its themes of loyalty unto death and the tragedy of noble failure resonating through English culture. Modern historians analyzing Maldon focus on the tactical and strategic lessons. Tactically, the battle demonstrates the overwhelming importance of terrain in pre-modern warfare. Berthanoth held a position that made his victories certain, a narrow causeway that neutralized Viking advantages and maximized English numerical superiority. By voluntarily giving up that position, he transformed certain victory into possible defeat. This is a lesson that applies to all warfare throughout history. Defensive advantages should not be thrown away without extremely compelling reasons. Strategically, Maldon demonstrates the danger of personalizing warfare, of making military decisions based on honor and reputation rather than cold calculation of costs and benefits. Berthanoth wanted a glorious victory, a heroic battle worthy of poetry and song. He got poetry and song, but he also got defeat, death, and consequences that damaged England for a generation. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that the goal of warfare is to achieve political objectives with minimum cost, not to fight glorious battles. If Berthanoth had simply waited, starved the Vikings into submission without fighting, he would have achieved his political objective, protecting England and eliminating a Viking raiding force at virtually no cost. It would not have been glorious, but it would have been effective. By choosing glory over effectiveness, he condemned thousands of his warriors to death and enabled decades of increased Viking raiding.
The question that has fascinated historians for a millennium is, why did Berthanoth make such an obviously bad tactical decision? Several theories have been proposed. The noble culture theory suggests that Anglo-Saxon military culture, inherited from Germanic traditions, placed such enormous value on personal courage, heroic combat, and glorious death in battle that commanders felt compelled to fight in the most heroic manner possible, regardless of tactical realities. For a noble like Berthanoth, winning by waiting behind a barrier, no matter how sensible tactically, would have seemed cowardly, unworthy of his status and reputation. Better to die gloriously in a fair fight than live with the shame of victory achieved through caution. This cultural imperative to fight honorably was a weakness that more pragmatic enemies like the Vikings could exploit. The military inexperience theory suggests that despite his age and status, Berthanoth may have lacked recent combat experience against skilled opponents. Most Anglo-Saxon military activity in the late 10th century involved suppressing bandits, enforcing royal authority over rebellious nobles, and other low-intensity operations against poorly equipped opponents. Berthanoth may not have fully appreciated how dangerous professional Viking warriors were in open combat. He may have genuinely believed that English numerical superiority was so overwhelming that the tactical details did not matter, that sheer numbers would crush the Vikings regardless of where they fought. This was a catastrophic miscalculation, but it may have seemed reasonable to a commander who had never faced Vikings in a major battle before. The political pressure theory suggests that Berthnoth faced pressure from his army to fight rather than wait. Anglo-Saxon feared levies were farmers who wanted to return to their fields. If Berthnoth had settled in for a siege of Northy Island that might last weeks, his army might have simply dissolved through desertion. Additionally, there may have been political pressure from King Ethelred's court to achieve a decisive, visible victory rather than a quiet siege. Ethelred's reign was already showing signs of weakness, and a glorious battlefield victory might have strengthened the kingdom's prestige and deterred future raids. This theory suggests Berthnoth was making a calculated political gamble that went catastrophically wrong. The overconfidence theory, perhaps most commonly accepted, simply takes the poem at its word: overmod, excessive pride, overconfidence. Berthnoth looked at his enormous army, looked at the tiny Viking force, and could not imagine losing. He thought the Vikings would break and run as soon as they faced his shield wall on open ground. He did not respect Viking combat capabilities, treating them as bandits rather than professional warriors. This contempt for the enemy led him to take unnecessary risks, confident that the disparity in numbers made the battle's outcome inevitable. He was proven tragically wrong. Whatever Berthnoth's motivations, his decision at Maldon became a cautionary tale studied in military academies and discussed by historians. It is a perfect example of how not to use a defensive advantage, how pride can blind commanders to tactical reality, and how cultural values that seem admirable can become military liabilities when facing pragmatic enemies.
The Viking perspective on Maldon reveals a very different military culture. For Olaf Tryggvason and his warriors, there was no shame in accepting Berthnoth's offer to fight on open ground. They did not see it as dishonorable or as validating English courage. They saw it as English stupidity, a gift handed to them by an enemy too proud or too foolish to use his advantages. Viking culture valued results over form, victory over honor, pragmatism over glory. A Viking commander who achieved victory through deception, ambush, or exploiting enemy mistakes was praised, not criticized for lacking honor. This cultural difference gave Vikings a systematic advantage over enemies like the Anglo-Saxons, who fought according to more restrictive cultural codes. Olaf Tryggvason used his victory at Maldon to enhance his reputation and political position in Norway. When he returned to Scandinavia wealthy from English silver, with stories of defeating an English army many times larger than his force, his prestige soared. This helped him in his political maneuvering to claim the Norwegian throne, which he achieved in 995. His brief reign as King Olaf I Tryggvason from 995 to 1000 was marked by his energetic attempts to Christianize Norway, using methods both persuasive and violent. He died in the Battle of Maldon in 1000, fighting against a coalition of his enemies, leaping from his ship when defeat was certain rather than being captured. Even his death was theatrical and memorable, fitting for a man whose life had been defined by dramatic moments like Maldon. The historical legacy of Maldon extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle became embedded in English cultural memory as a symbol of tragic heroism, of courage in defeat, of loyalty maintained even when all was lost. The poem, The Battle of Maldon, was copied and preserved in monasteries, studied by scholars, and influenced English literature for centuries. Its themes of duty, sacrifice, and the tragedy of noble failure would reappear in English poetry and drama for a millennium. When J.R.R. Tolkien wrote about the last stand of heroes against impossible odds, he was drawing on a tradition that includes Maldon. The famous phrase, "Mind must be firmer, heart keener, courage greater as our strength lessens," became a touchstone of English Stoicism, the idea of fighting hardest when the situation is most desperate. Militarily, Maldon marked a turning point in the Viking Age in England. Before Maldon, Viking raids were opportunistic attacks on coastal targets, with the raiders fleeing when serious opposition appeared. After Maldon, Vikings realized they could face and defeat English armies in open battle, which encouraged larger-scale invasions. The success at Maldon contributed to the escalation of Viking activity that would eventually lead to the Danish conquest of England under Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute the Great. By 1016, just 25 years after Maldon, a Danish king sat on the English throne, ruling an empire that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. The road to that conquest began at Maldon.
The archaeological evidence from Maldon and the surrounding area provides some physical confirmation of the battle. Metal detector finds in the region have uncovered Viking and Anglo-Saxon weapons, including sword fragments, spearheads, and shield bosses dating to the late 10th century. The causeway to Northy Island still exists and can be walked at low tide, allowing visitors to stand where the English shield wall initially formed and understand the tactical situation. The narrowness of the causeway makes Berthnoth's decision even more inexplicable when you see it physically. 3 men can barely stand abreast, and the Vikings would have been slaughtered trying to force it. Local tradition in Maldon has preserved memories of the battle for over a millennium. A statue of Berthnoth was erected in the town in 2006, showing him as a towering warrior with sword and shield, commemorating the tragic hero. The statue sparked some controversy because some historians and local residents questioned whether a man whose pride led to catastrophic defeat should be honored with a monument. But others argued that Berthnoth deserved commemoration precisely because of the complexity of his legacy, as a brave man whose courage was undermined by fatal judgment, a reminder that heroism and wisdom do not always coincide. The statue stands today near the causeway, a 9-foot-tall bronze figure looking toward Northy Island, where the Vikings once waited. The impact of Maldon on Anglo-Saxon military doctrine was profound, but came too late to save Ethelred's kingdom. English commanders in subsequent encounters with Vikings showed more tactical caution, more willingness to use defensive positions and avoid pitched battles unless circumstances were favorable. But the damage to English morale and the encouragement given to Viking raiders by Maldon's outcome could not be undone. The battle had demonstrated English vulnerability at the worst possible moment, when King Ethelred's weak leadership had already created political instability. One of the most fascinating aspects of Maldon is how it was remembered and recorded by both sides. The Anglo-Saxon poem preserves English perspectives with remarkable honesty, not hiding the defeat or Berthnoth's questionable decision, but instead focusing on the heroism of individuals who maintained their oaths and died fighting. This cultural willingness to memorialize defeat and learn from it, to create literature that analyzed failures rather than simply celebrating victories, demonstrates a sophisticated approach to military history. The Vikings also remembered Maldon, though their accounts have not survived in the same detail. Scandinavian sagas mention Olaf Tryggvason's exploits in England, though they focus more on his later career as Norwegian king than on individual battles. What is clear from indirect evidence is that Maldon enhanced Olaf's reputation across Scandinavia, marking him as a warrior of exceptional skill and courage.
The religious dimension of Maldon deserves attention because it shaped how contemporaries understood the battle's meaning. For Anglo-Saxon Christians, the defeat raised troubling theological questions. Why had God allowed Christian warriors fighting to defend their homeland against pagan raiders to be defeated despite their numerical superiority? The poem addresses this implicitly by focusing on individual Christian virtue, the warriors who maintained their oaths and died bravely, suggesting that spiritual victory through maintaining faith and courage matters more than tactical victory on the battlefield. Some English religious writers interpreted the Viking successes as divine punishment for English sins, arguing that defeats like Maldon were God's way of testing and purifying the English people. This interpretation helped maintain faith in divine providence despite military setbacks, but also created a fatalistic mindset
where military defeats were accepted as God's will rather than analyzed for tactical lessons. Conversely, some Viking warriors at Maldon may still have been pagan, though Olaf Tryggvason himself was Christian or would convert shortly after this period. The religious dynamics were actually more complex than simple Christian versus pagan warfare. Many Vikings had converted to Christianity by 991, or practiced a syncretic faith that combined Christian and pagan elements. This made the conflict less a religious war and more a struggle between kingdoms and cultures that happened to have different religious identities. The economics of Maldon and the Danegeld system it enabled deserve examination because they reveal how Viking raiding functioned as an economic enterprise. For Viking warriors, raiding England was not random violence, but a calculated investment. A warrior invested time, resources, and risk in joining a raiding expedition with the expectation of return on that investment through plunder or Danegeld. The victory at Maldon provided immediate plunder from the battlefield, weapons and armor from dead English warriors, and then the enormous Danegeld payment of 22,000 pounds of silver. Divided among perhaps 500 warriors who survived the battle, each man received approximately 44 pounds of silver, a fortune representing several years' income for most people in medieval Europe. This massive payout made raiding England extremely attractive economically. The word spread across Scandinavia: England is wealthy, poorly defended, and will pay enormous sums to avoid fighting. This economic incentive drew more Vikings to raid England, creating a positive feedback loop from the Viking perspective and a destructive spiral from the English perspective. England was trapped in a system where paying the Danegeld encouraged more Viking raids, but refusing to pay meant facing military action when English forces had proven unable to win decisive victories. The economic drain of Danegeld payments eventually became unsustainable, contributing to the economic and political collapse that enabled the Danish conquest of England.
The social impact of Maldon on English society extended beyond the immediate military and economic consequences. The death of so many warriors, potentially several thousand men, created a demographic impact on Essex and surrounding regions. These were not just soldiers, but farmers, craftsmen, and heads of households. Their deaths created widows and orphans, disrupted agricultural labor, and transferred property ownership as estates passed to heirs who may not have been prepared to manage them. The social dislocation from a single disastrous battle rippled through communities for years. The psychological trauma on survivors and their communities was also significant. Men who fled the battlefield at Maldon faced social stigma in their home communities. Anglo-Saxon culture valued courage and loyalty highly, and warriors who abandoned their comrades faced shame that could last for life. The poem specifically names and condemns some who fled, ensuring their cowardice would be remembered for centuries. Conversely, the families of warriors who died fighting at Maldon gained honor. Their deceased relatives remembered as heroes who maintained their oaths unto death. This cultural response to the battle reinforced Anglo-Saxon martial values even in defeat, celebrating courage while condemning cowardice, attempting to extract positive meaning from catastrophe. The military technology at Maldon was typical of late 10th century Northern European warfare, relatively simple by later medieval standards, but effective in the hands of skilled warriors. Both sides used similar weapons: swords, axes, spears, and shields. The sword was the prestige weapon, expensive to produce, requiring skilled smiths and high-quality iron, typically owned only by wealthy warriors. Most warriors at Maldon probably fought with spears, the universal weapon of early medieval infantry, effective for thrusting and shield wall combat and cheaper to produce than swords. Axes were particularly favored by Vikings, both as weapons and tools, and Scandinavian warriors had developed sophisticated axe fighting techniques. The Danish axe, a long-handled weapon that could be swung with both hands, could split shields and helmets with devastating force. Though it required the warrior to drop his shield to use,
making it a high-risk, high-reward weapon. Shields were essential equipment, typically made of linden wood planks covered with leather with an iron boss in the center to protect the hand. A warrior's shield was his primary defensive equipment, used to block enemy weapons and push in shield wall combat. Armor varied by wealth. Rich warriors like Brythnoth wore chainmail, expensive but effective protection against cuts and slashes, though vulnerable to strong piercing thrusts. Poorer warriors wore leather armor or padded cloth, cheaper but offering less protection. Helmets were less common than popular culture suggests, expensive to make and owned primarily by wealthy warriors. Many fighters at Maldon probably fought with no head protection beyond a leather cap.
The absence of missile weapons from the detailed account of Maldon is notable. The poem mentions javelins and throwing spears in the early stages, but says nothing about archery, suggesting neither side employed archers in significant numbers. This fits with what we know about Anglo-Saxon and Viking warfare in this period. The English longbow that would dominate later medieval battlefields had not yet been developed. Bows existed but were hunting weapons, not military weapons of significance. The crossbow was known but rare in Northern Europe in 991. Most missile combat involved thrown weapons, spears, javelins, and hand axes, effective at short range but limited compared to later missile technology. The primary weapon system of both sides was the shield wall formation, disciplined infantry fighting in tight formation with spears and shields, supplemented by individual heroes wielding swords and axes. This was warfare that depended on physical strength, courage, training, and unit cohesion more than technology. The lack of significant technological advantage for either side meant the battle's outcome depended on leadership, tactics, and morale, areas where the Vikings proved superior despite their numerical inferiority. The site of the Battle of Maldon has been studied by archaeologists and historians, attempting to reconstruct exactly where the fighting occurred and what the battlefield looked like in 991. The causeway to Northey Island still floods at high tide and is exposed at low tide, just as it did in the 10th century, though coastal erosion has changed some details. The island itself is now largely pasture, privately owned, and can be visited by permission. Archaeological surveys have found evidence of Anglo-Saxon and Viking presence in the area, though definitively linking specific finds to the battle is difficult. Metal detector enthusiasts have discovered period weapons and equipment in fields around Maldon, suggesting that the fighting spread beyond the immediate causeway area as the English army routed. The landscape has changed in other ways over a millennium. Medieval Maldon was smaller than the modern town, a modest trading settlement rather than the substantial urban area it is today. The coastline has shifted through erosion and deposition. Trees and vegetation patterns have changed dramatically. But the essential geography, the tidal causeway creating a choke point between island and mainland, remains, allowing us to understand the tactical situation Brythnoth faced and the magnitude of his error in abandoning his defensive position.
Comparing Maldon to other Viking victories reveals common patterns in Viking success. At the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, Vikings again faced superior numbers but maintained discipline and unit cohesion while their Irish enemies fragmented. At Stamford Bridge in 1066, a small Viking force initially held a narrow bridge against a much larger English army, demonstrating again the power of choke points in medieval warfare. Vikings were not invincible. They suffered numerous defeats throughout the Viking Age, but they excelled at exploiting enemy mistakes, maintaining discipline in chaotic circumstances, and fighting with a pragmatism unencumbered by the restrictive honor codes that bound some of their enemies. The Viking military system emphasized effectiveness over honor, victory over glory, results over reputation. This cultural difference gave them an edge against opponents like the Anglo-Saxons, who sometimes prioritized fighting heroically over fighting intelligently. However, we must be careful not to romanticize Viking military superiority. Vikings also lost battles frequently. They were decisively defeated at Edington by Alfred the Great in 878. They lost at Brunanburh in 937. They would lose catastrophically at Stamford Bridge in 1066 when a Norwegian invasion of England was crushed. Vikings were skilled warriors, but they were not superhuman. What distinguished Viking victories like Maldon was not inherent Viking superiority, but specific circumstances where Viking strengths, mobility, discipline, and pragmatism exploited enemy weaknesses, poor leadership, restrictive cultural codes, and lack of unity. The leadership contrast between Berthnoth and Olaf Tryggvason at Maldon is instructive for understanding medieval command. Berthnoth led from the front, fighting personally in the shield wall, visible to his men, sharing their danger. This was inspiring and created intense loyalty, but it also made him vulnerable. When he was killed, the English army lost not just a commander, but a symbol, a figure whose presence had been holding the line together. His death created instant demoralization and triggered the collapse. Olaf Tryggvason also led from the front according to Viking custom, but he led a smaller, more cohesive force where leadership was distributed among multiple proven warriors. If Olaf had fallen, other Viking commanders could have taken over without the same collapse of morale, because Viking command structure was less dependent on a single charismatic leader. This structural difference in command systems gave Vikings resilience that Anglo-Saxon armies sometimes lacked. Additionally, Olaf demonstrated superior tactical judgment. When offered the chance to fight on open ground, he recognized it as the gift it was and accepted without hesitation. When the battle began, he focused his forces effectively, apparently targeting Berthnoth specifically to decapitate English command. When the English line broke, he exploited the opportunity immediately with a general assault. These were the decisions of a commander who understood battlefield dynamics and made choices based on effectiveness rather than honor or tradition.
The poem The Battle of Maldon itself deserves analysis as a historical source. It was composed within a few decades of the battle, possibly by someone who participated or interviewed survivors, giving it significant historical value. But it is poetry, not chronicle, and it shapes events to fit poetic and didactic purposes. The poem emphasizes individual heroism, loyalty, and the tragedy of noble failure because those were themes valued in Anglo-Saxon culture. It may exaggerate the heroism of English warriors who stood and fought, while minimizing the number who fled. It presents Berthnoth's overmod critically, but also sympathetically, as a tragic flaw in an otherwise admirable man rather than simple stupidity. The poem served cultural functions beyond historical record. It reinforced Anglo-Saxon values of loyalty, courage, and duty. It provided consolation in defeat by celebrating the virtue of those who died honorably. It created a narrative framework for understanding the disaster that preserved social cohesion despite military failure. Modern historians must read the poem critically, recognizing its literary purposes while extracting historical information. What the poem tells us about events may be partly shaped by poetic convention, but what it tells us about Anglo-Saxon values, military culture, and how they understood courage and duty is invaluable. The legacy of Maldon for English military thought extends into later periods. English commanders in subsequent centuries studied the battle as an example of how not to command. The lesson, "Do not throw away defensive advantages for the sake of glory," became proverbial. When English armies did achieve great victories, such as at Agincourt in 1415, they did so by using defensive positions effectively, forcing the enemy to attack them on unfavorable ground, rather than seeking glorious but tactically foolish engagements. Agincourt, where English longbowmen behind stakes destroyed French cavalry, represents the opposite approach from Maldon, using terrain and defensive advantages ruthlessly, caring about effectiveness rather than fighting fairly. The contrast between Maldon and Agincourt illustrates the evolution of English military culture over 4 centuries, from valuing heroic combat
to valuing victory by any effective means. The Viking legacy from Maldon is more complex to trace because Viking political entities evolved rapidly in the century after 991. The unified Viking kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden gradually replaced the raiding culture that had produced warriors like Olaf Tryggvason's force. By the 12th century, Scandinavian kingdoms fought wars more like other European kingdoms, with feudal armies and increasingly similar military cultures. The raid-based warfare that made Maldon possible faded into history, replaced by state-based military systems. But the memory of Viking military prowess persisted in Scandinavian culture, a source of national pride and identity.
Visiting Maldon today, you can walk the causeway to Northy Island at low tide, standing where English and Viking shield walls faced each other over a millennium ago. The island is quiet, used for grazing cattle, showing no obvious signs of the violence that occurred there. But the landscape speaks if you understand the tactical language. The narrowness of the causeway, barely wide enough for 3 men, makes clear why this was such a strong defensive position. The open ground on the mainland, where the actual battle occurred, shows why, once the Vikings crossed, they could deploy and fight effectively despite their inferior numbers. The site helps us understand both Berthnoth's initial advantage and his catastrophic decision to abandon it. The town of Maldon has embraced its historical significance with a museum and interpretive materials about the battle, though it competes for attention with the town's other historical features, including its role in medieval salt production and later maritime trade. For most visitors, Maldon is a pleasant Essex town, not a battlefield pilgrimage site like Gettysburg or Waterloo. But for those interested in Viking Age history and medieval warfare, it offers a rare opportunity to walk a battlefield whose geography has changed remarkably little in 1,000 years. To stand where English and Viking warriors fought and died, and to contemplate how individual decisions in the chaos of battle can shape the course of nations. The Battle of Maldon stands as one of the most analyzed and debated engagements in medieval military history, despite its relatively small scale and lack of immediate strategic consequences. Its significance lies not in the number of men involved or territory conquered, but in what it reveals about leadership, decision-making, cultural values, and the gap between heroic ideals and tactical reality. A commander threw away certain victory for the sake of honor and glory, and paid for that decision with his life and the lives of thousands of his men. A small Viking force, outnumbered beyond reason, exploited that error with discipline and skill to achieve an impossible victory. The psychological and political consequences of that victory reverberated through England for a generation, encouraging Viking raids, leading to enormous payments of Danegeld, and ultimately contributing to the Danish conquest of England. All of this flowed from a single decision on a summer day in 991, when Berthnoth ordered his men to step back from the causeway and let the Vikings cross. In those few moments, he transformed certain victory into possible defeat, and that possibility became reality through Viking skill and English collapse. The battle reminds us that in war, as in all human endeavors, intentions matter less than results. Courage without wisdom is dangerous, and the gap between how we want to be remembered and how we should act to achieve our objectives can be fatal. Berthnoth got his glorious battle and his heroic death and his place in poetry and legend, but he also got defeat and death for thousands who trusted his leadership, and consequences that damaged his kingdom for a generation. Whether that trade was worth it depends on what you value more: personal honor or collective success, heroic reputation or tactical effectiveness, dying gloriously or winning intelligently.